You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thanks for joining Revolution 250. This is where we remember events that took place 250 years ago this week. It's a short bonus episode from the American Revolution podcast to remember these important anniversaries from the Revolutionary War. This week we remember the selection of a committee that will draft the Declaration of Independence. The committee was formed on June 11th, 1776. The issue of independence was squarely in front of Congress when Richard Henry Lee introduced the proposal on June 7th. Congress quickly tabled that question so that delegates could send word back to their states to make sure everybody was on board with independence. In the meantime, though, Congress began setting up committees that would be ready if the delegates did approve independence. On June 11th, Congress set up 3 different committees. One was to draft Articles of Confederation. A second was to come up with a plan to negotiate treaties with foreign countries. And a third was to draft the formal Declaration of Independence so that they had a specific document ready to go when the vote for independence took place. The 5 delegates on the Declaration Committee were Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert Livingston of New York. The Declaration Committee was not considered particularly important. 4 of the 5 members on the committee were serving on other committees that were created that same day. Franklin and Adams served on the Foreign Affairs Committee. They were focused on getting a treaty with France, which was considered vital to the cause. Livingston and Sherman served on the committee that was drafting the Articles of Confederation, which would serve as a constitution for the new government. Thomas Jefferson, as the junior member, was only assigned to this committee. After all, he'd only joined Congress about a month earlier. But even Jefferson had his distractions. At the same time he was working on drafting the Declaration, he had also been working to help draft a proposed constitution for the state of Virginia, including a Declaration of Rights. So he was actively corresponding with members of the Virginia Convention in Virginia, helping with that project while he was working on his draft of the Declaration. Now, years later, critics would argue that Jefferson did not come up with anything original in writing the Declaration, but in fact cribbed it from many other sources. In response, Jefferson agreed with them. As Jefferson put it, this was the object of the Declaration of Independence. Not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of, not merely to say things which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject, in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent, and to justify ourselves in the independent stand which we are compelled to take, neither aiming at originality of principle or sentiment, nor yet copied from any particular or previous writing. It was intended to be an expression of the American mind, and to give to that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. John Adams wrote about the process decades later as well. He claimed that he had to talk Jefferson into writing the first draft. Of course, this was after the Declaration had become much more revered than it was at the time it was originally drafted, so Adams might have been trying to emphasize his own importance in the process. According to the Adams account, Jefferson knocked out the first draft within a couple of days after his assignment. He showed the draft to Adams and Franklin before bringing it to the whole committee. The committee worked on it then for a few weeks, but the basic structure that Jefferson had laid out initially remained intact. The committee met and made a few more changes. According to Adams, Franklin and Sherman contribute almost nothing in committee. He doesn't even mention Livingston. There are, however, several notes on the draft that are written in Franklin's handwriting, so that we know Franklin at least had a hand in it, and we suspect many of the other changes in Thomas Jefferson's hand were made based on oral suggestions given during the committee discussions. The entire process for the committee took about 2.5 weeks. On June 28th, the committee submitted its proposed declaration to the full Continental Congress. At that point, members of the Congress made additional changes, including famously the removal of Jefferson's mention of slavery. Jefferson was upset by many of the changes that Congress made to his draft. He ended up sending copies of his draft to several colleagues in Virginia, asking their views of whether Congress's changes improved or harmed the document. Of course, this correspondence would have no outcome on the final version of the document, since any response would have been received days or weeks after the final version was approved. Now, Congress did continue to debate and alter the language for several days, even during the time they were voting on independence itself, which finally took place on July 2nd. Debate continued over the wording the rest of the day of the 2nd and on the 3rd and even on the morning of the 4th. Finally, towards the end of the morning on July 4th, Congress finally gave its approval to the document. Just to blow up another myth, the signing of the declaration would actually take place weeks later in August, so that the only thing that really happened on July 4th was approval of the declaration wording. I hope you've enjoyed this Revolution 250 moment. For more details on this topic, check out episode 99 of the American Revolution podcast at blog.amrevpodcast.com. You can also subscribe for free to the whole podcast on whatever platform you like. Thanks again for listening to this Revolution 250 moment on the American Revolution podcast.